Yeah, I want to thank the BFUU to sponsor this and help us provide the hall for tonight's important meeting. So, my name is Steve Zeltzer, and I produce a show on KPFA called Workweek Radio on Tuesday at 3:30 or 4, and also I'm a staff representative on the local station board representing the staff. So I want to greet you, brothers and sisters, for coming to this important meeting. It's interesting today, there's another article in the Chronicle, the pink section, that KPFA has been saved again by a loan. So there's been a lot of coverage in the media about KPFA and Pacifica, and I'm sure all of you here are here because you're concerned about Pacifica and KPFA and what happens to alternative media in the United States, as I am and many other people are. So the issues that have faced KPFA and Pacifica, of course, are not unique. The corporatization of the media monopolies want to destroy any kind of alternative media in this country that have an anti-war line, that have a line taking on capitalism and the billionaires. And it's obvious that the concern, particularly that is happening now about the media is becoming media monopolies. One company like Sinclair controlling all the stations, and in a community controlling the radio, the TV, and even the newspapers, is a threat to democracy and democratic rights for all people in the United States. This is a critical question. So KPFA and Pacifica has been a very important alternative historically to the mainstream media from when it was set up against war and against U.S. imperialism and the wars of U.S. imperialism. And today, with Trump as the president, the danger of war is growing. The U.S. troops in the Ukraine, surrounding of Russia, war threats against Russia. I mean, sanctions. There should be sanctions against the United States for all the invasions the United States has been involved in. You know, talk about sanctions. You know, how about sanctioning the biggest intervener in countries? And of course, also the whole question of the Asian pivot and the threat to destroy North Korea, the contempt by Vice President Pence of the Korean people when he refused to stand. He did a knee, but he did a knee for right-wing reasons. And the Korean people, of course, are opposed to war. They don't want a war because it would mean the loss of millions and millions of lives in Asia. So these issues of war and peace are something that Pacifica and KPFA have to be involved in. It's a question of survival of the people of this country and the people of the world. And we're going to learn some important things today, some opportunities for Pacifica and KPFA, because when I first became aware of KPFA, my grandmother actually listened to KPFA and used to call in. It was during the 60s when there was a mass movement. And one of the reasons that KPFA had such a relevance is it would actually cover things live. Like there were mass rallies at UC, and they were covered live by KPFA, and it had tremendous support. And this is something that we want to talk about in this forum, and that is covering the live struggles that are going on in this country and in the Bay Area so that people can hear the voices of the people who are involved in them. When thousands of people march against the Nazis, KPFA should be there live, asking people why they're there and what the issues are. When thousands of women march, we should be there live, interviewing the women and the people participating in these marches. And if you want to know how KPFA and Pacifica can become relevant, if we start covering these mass movements live, we will get a relevant and large audience. People begin to pay attention, and we can solve some of our financial problems. And that's some of the things that we will be talking about today. So we're going to start off by struggles that have taken place in the history of KPFA, and of course there have been always internal struggles at KPFA. This is nothing new. From the beginning of KPFA and Pacifica Foundation, there have always been struggles of who's in charge, democracy, and KPFA being a vision for all the people. And the first speaker who has a long struggle in KPFA for democracy and is a programmer in Mendocino is Jeff Blankfort. And Jeff Blankfort has been involved in a long struggle for democracy in KPFA and the Pacifica Foundation. So welcome, Jeff Blankfort.
Turning them off, to put them on airplane mode, because that's helpful to people who have EMF sensitivity.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. This is a very important subject which was dear to my life going back to when I first started listening to KPFA back in the, I guess, 60s, 70s. But in 1992, something came up that disturbed me. At that time, David Solniker, the director of Pacifica, had ruled that there be no discussion or critical discussion of Zionism on KPFA and Pacifica. And lo and behold, KPFA initiated a new program, a pro-Israel program, by a Zionist fellow I knew. And I went to a KPFA staff meeting to say this program should not be on the air. But I found out something that night which changed my mind completely, not about the program, but something was much more important. Larry Bensky had with him the strategy for national programming, a thick booklet Pacifica had put out, and he let me take a look at it. And lo and behold, what did I find? That Pacifica had already, this is in 1992, approached and applied for loans from the Pew Foundation, Ford Foundation, and the MacArthur Foundation. And in the strategy, it said, we will tailor our programming to meet the demands of these foundations. This was astonishing. Bensky didn't think there was a problem with it, but I did. And there's a fellow, the late Werner Hertz, also did. And we started something called Save KPFA, which a name was later ripped off by people who had nothing to do to trying to save KPFA years later. So what happened, we started having local meetings, and then in 1993, early February 1993, there was a meeting, Pacifica board meeting down in Los Angeles, but not Los Angeles, actually. It was on the Beverly Hills border, 1 block south of the Sunset Strip, 1 block east of Doheny, a very fancy neighborhood, a very fancy hotel, non-union hotel, which was being picketed. Our meeting was picketed, the Pacifica meeting, by KPFK programmers, black programmers, who stood around the board members with signs saying, plantation radio, no, liberation radio, yes. Out in front, members of KPFK staff, programmers, volunteers, paid, walked up and down protesting, while Pat Scott, a former member of the Communist Party, an African-American woman, and it was very important that I identify her as such, because she was out there at the time explaining to some young men walking up down the street what was actually happening and who these crazies were picketing her meeting. Pat Scott apparently had been selected by someone, and I'm saying a U.S. government, to destroy Pacifica and change what it was. This required, as we found out, in 1995, first the firing of Bill Mandel from the air, a longtime programmer on Soviet affairs. He was taken off the air, and unfortunately, the staff at KPFA acquiesced in this. Why was he taken off the air? Because he had a segment every Wednesday morning on East Europe. And one morning he decided, rather than talking about what was going on in East Europe, he was a Soviet specialist, he was so outraged by a racist column by Art Hoppe, a San Francisco Chronicle columnist, that he felt he had to speak out against this racist column by Art Hoppe. For Pacifica, for KPFA, Bill Mandel had gone off subject, and he was taken off the air. There was a small protest up and down in front of the station, but that was it. All the members of the KPFA staff went along with that at the time.
He's never been replaced.
I'm sorry?
He died.
He's never been replaced, I said.
He'd never been, yes. And, yeah. In any case, Bill had a program for 30 years on the air, and he stood for, for civil rights, for justice. He was confronted in the McCarthy Committee. A man of tremendous courage. And yet, you could add up all the programmers that KPFA didn't have that kind of courage, and Bill Mandel was let go. And unfortunately, someone took it off the Pacifica chronology, which I helped to contribute to. But that was in May 1995. Since that attracted no protest, significant protest, Pat Scott then followed with the purge of maybe 150 volunteer programmers from KPFA. Up to that point, KPFA and all the Pacific stations were essentially programmed by volunteers. So you would have people, actually working people, say 4 people were to be in a group, a collective, a labor collective, or Native American, African American, and they'd have a different host every week. So those people who were actually working people could do programs like KPFA, and also work at a job and be connected to reality. Whereas what happened afterward, Pat Scott decided in 1995 that we had to professionalize the sound at KPFA. And that means hire programmers, pay programmers, and eliminate the volunteers. This is why KPFA has to raise money 1 out of every 5 days every year, because of the huge number of paid programmers. And it's hard to reverse that. This is her legacy. In any case, for example, Jerry Brown might not be governor today if it wasn't for Pat Scott putting him on the air from noon to 1, Monday through Friday, replacing a number of popular programmers, including Mama O'Shea, who had a shout-out program, had been on for many years, was really popular. There was no discussion about this. This was an arbitrary, hands-down thing. And, of course, Mama also had a very good position on Palestine, and I had been a guest on her program a number of times. So this was an example of what happened, and then people started protesting. We had meetings in Ashkenaz and around. We started something called Take Back KPFA after that firing, and then we found out that when we went to Pacifica board meetings, we could not get the agenda, we could not get the minutes, and the program, the meetings were improperly, illegally announced according to Corporation Public Broadcasting regulations. It got to the point where I went down, in 1993, I should say, the first one, after I'd made this discovery, in which they approved, the Pacifica Board approved the strategy for national programming. The one where they were picketing, Mariah Gillardin, who you'll hear from later, she had requested at a previous board meeting up in Berkeley a financial report on some irregularities. And Jack Odell, who was the president of Pacifica, who had been a friend of mine, and as had been Pat Scott, a friend of mine, Jack Odell, the president of Pacifica, promised us that we could make our personal statements after we made statements representing the groups he represented. I believe Mariah was representing unpaid staff, and I was representing Take Back KPFA. But then we weren't allowed to make our own statements afterward, and because the board was upset at all these protesters, Jack Odell adjourned the meeting. Mariah stood by the door as they were leaving, trying to give them papers about describing Pacifica's financial irregularity. We found out later the next week on the air that Mariah had been accused of violence, physical violence, against Pacifica board members, including a pregnant woman. And despite the fact that KPFK had filmed everything, and there was not a shred of evidence, we could not get a lawyer here in the Bay Area to take Mariah's case of defamation on the air by KPFA. 1995, Take Back KPFA then sent me down to Houston for the board meeting. but it wasn't in Houston. It was halfway between Houston and Galveston at a resort that was not accessible by public transportation. There were 3 board meetings taking place in that resort: Pacifica, Bear Aspirin, and Pennzoil. Good company, right? So I walked into the boardroom with my tape recorder and microphone out with Jackie, a Native American programmer from KPFT, and immediately Pat Scott said, "Jeff Blankfort is in the room." And they immediately, the chair of the board, changed the agenda. Everything that was public was now an executive session. So we were allowed to sit in the back of the room, and Roberta Brooks, I believe her name was, who worked for Ron Dellums, the secretary of Pacifica, she walked all the way back to see my tape recorder wasn't running. So then we had to leave during the major part of the meeting. That night it was 25th anniversary celebration of KPFT, and I went there with Jackie to the party at the hotel downtown. Garland Gantner, the general manager of KPFT, who would later be brought in by Pacifica to run the station when they boarded it up in 1999, Garland Gantner saw me and had the security police, take me out of the building, out of the hotel in Houston. This is Pacifica Radio. By 1997, excuse me, okay. That story made its way into Current, an trade organ of nonprofit radio. I get a call from a guy named, what's his name, Brian? Brian McConville, he was an investigator for the CPB, called me, and he said, "I want to talk to you about what happened to you in Houston, Pacifica." I said, "I'm not ready to talk about it." He said, "It's not up to you. It's our job to monitor what is going on in public radio, community radio." And so he started investigating Pacifica. He was the number 3 person in the CPB. 17 days later, he's told to clean out his drawer and leave the office immediately. He said, "What about the Pacifica investigation? Forget about it." Then I called later to the acting inspector general, Mike Donovan. Very friendly guy. I'm talking about the problems with Pacifica. He said, "Sounds like you've got a case. We're going to deal with it the first of the year." First of the year comes and goes. I called end of January. "Mike Donovan, please." He's no longer with us. Someone had intervened. The federal government had intervened. They did not want Pacific investigated. Now, finally, they hired a former Army IG, and he came out to interview some of us, Mariah, myself, and a few other people. And I actually made a formal legal document stating all the violations Pacific had made of the CPB regulations. And I went back in 1997 to testify in front of the CPB. I walk into his office, and he says to me, this is the Inspector General of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, "The fix is in." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, I'm supporting your report. What you wrote is correct, is true. But the statement that's going to be made by the head of the board of the CPB is going to give a whitewash to Pacifica and say the exact opposite. I said, "I can't believe that." He said, "That's the way it is. And by the way, when we go into the meeting, we should go in through separate doors." Then, this is the CPB. I go in there, there's Nicole Sawaya, who was working for NPR there, who was my neighbor in San Francisco, wouldn't talk to me. There was a seat with my name on it. There's Jack O'Dell, my old friend, who I had kept posted about what was going on, thinking I could trust him. I couldn't. Jack is glaring at me, and here is the CPB praising Pacifica for all the wonderful work it's done. And Jack is gleaming. And when Pat Scott retired in 1998, Robert Coonrod, who was the head of the CPB, but the former head of Voice of America, and Radio Marti, put out a special press release praising Pat Scott for the great work she'd done for Pacifica. Now, I have maintained all along, this was a COINTEL operation, Pacifica was too important not to be destroyed, and it still is. And this is why the government will use agents, collaborators, and useful idiots to destroy this station, destroy this network. Ironically, there are people on the station, the collaborators. In 1995, there was a strike going on, a union organizing a hotel in Lafayette. And one of the organizers was being interviewed by David Bacon, the labor host on KPFA on Wednesday morning. And he was talking about, this organizer was talking about the organization that was trying to destroy their ability to organize this hotel. It was called the American Consulting Group. Now, the truth of the matter was that at that very moment, which David Bacon didn't talk about, was that Pat Scott had hired the American Consulting Group to destroy the unions of KPFA and KPFK. And so here you see these people at KPFA, they're still there, pretending to be progressive and pretending to be radical, and they do some great stuff, but right on their own doorstep, they are collaborators. More than useful idiots, they don't know exactly what they're doing. And the same thing with the people who founded Save KPFA. They know exactly what they were doing. Some people have told me they want to make the station safe for the Democrats. There's a pretty good argument for that. I mean, not that I support that, but that's a good argument. That's what they want to do. But you have this situation where you go through the whole history of this, and by the way, there's a historian named Matthew Lazar, and who's supposed to be the KPFA historian, and he's quoted in the newspapers. He wrote an article 2 years ago, Is Pacifica Worth Saving?, which totally whitewashed everything I said. But he actually didn't mention any of the facts I've said, because he's not a historian. He is a lackey, a useful idiot, collaborator, whatever. But this is part of what you're struggling against in trying to keep this network alive. And I would recommend to you something I've contributed to years ago called Pacifica Chronology. You can find it online. And there are many, many more things here that you will find about what happened, which is important to read to understand what is going on. If you don't know your history, you don't understand the issues involved in the struggle. But I'll tell you right now, none of the people who were in the new Save KPFA, the new one, the ersatz one, were around to help the struggle to save KPFA and Pacifica at the time we were fighting to save it. So I will conclude there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. Now, one of the little-known facts about KPFA is that it used to have a women's department and put on programming on women, and we learned at the local station board that there is indeed going to be programming on Women's Day at KPFA. But the struggle to have a women's department, African-American department, Latino department, and a labor department could be an important asset to KPFA and Pacifica of all these struggles that are going on around the country. And the next speaker, Mariah Gladden with TUC Radio, was one of the people that fought for the women's department and was banned by KPFA, as has been reported by Jeff Blankfort. Welcome, Mariah Gladden.
It's really great to be here and see so many familiar faces after all these years. I mean, we sort of retired in 1999 from the Bay Area and live with coyotes and bears now, which are much friendlier than some of the people involved in Pacifica. I was so moved by the dilemma now that I'm not going to recount my personal history, as somebody asked me. Although I earned the name Mariah the Pariah then, and I kind of proudly remember that moment. For me, pretty much all the good things began when I finally left Pacifica, left KPFA. Well, I didn't have a choice. I was fired and I was banned. Actually, we had a meeting in Los Angeles where all the banned people had a reunion, and there were over 100, and I didn't quite know who to expect. The group of banned programmers and volunteers at KPFK was the biggest, and I was totally amazed when I walked into the room that almost everybody was African American. And then people came up to me and said, I heard you were banned from all Pacifica stations and the archives and the national. Yes. Oh, I only got banned from KPFK. So much for history. So the reason why I just chose two topics, one the FM licenses and the second one, the union issue, is that to me they seem bound up with the problems right now, and maybe what I remember, what I see could be helpful in finding our way through. The FM licenses are so dear to me because when I left, I became very involved in the low-power FM movement, and we fought tooth and nail for every single FM license. And we have thousands of stations now out there, under 100 watt. And I had a gentle revenge with Pat Scott because she was one of the people who helped kill the under 100 watt stations. And then people like Stephen Dunifer and Free Radio Berkeley were the ones who said, well, if we're banned, we're going on the air illegally. And that's how these stations began. And the very first broadcast Stephen Dunifer did was during our fights with KPFA. Outside the door of KPFA, we tied the antenna into the decorative plum tree, that some design I put there. And I snuck in and turned all the monitors inside and we broadcast what we thought about KPFA at that time. So my care for, my respect for, my love for FM licenses began with, of course, with Pacifica, because they were one of the first FM licenses around. They were ready to go AM, but that wasn't possible. And they built their own radios, as you know, because nobody was using FM. So that's a topic very dear to me. And when I heard that some of these licenses might be moved or sold, I said, I need to really come and urge everybody. That is the precious part of Pacifica. Buildings can be replaced. There's enough real estate that great donors gave to the station that should be leveraged against the debt, but not the licenses. And of course, people say that there's the internet, and I don't know if that is shared here, but I have an extremely dim view of the internet, and both as a technology and as a social medium. So what we're finding now is people like Variety last August wrote this article, oh, terrestrial radio is on its way out, and forget about it, and let's all walk arm in arm into this wonderful digital future. But Nielsen ratings, who are actually measuring listener and viewership, put out a report earlier this year saying that more Americans tune into AM and FM radio than to any other comparable medium, TV or even smartphones, tablets, or computers. FM is a wonderful technology. It's extremely reliable. We just had fires in Northern California, as I'm sure you know. The only signals that survived for us in Mendocino County was the FM station, because the cell phones went down within the first 2 hours. The towers melted, the internet was gone for most people. There was no way to communicate except on FM. And in bigger life, during the hurricanes in Texas and Louisiana, the FCC did something good for a change. They asked Apple to turn on the FM chips in the iPhones so people could use their phone to listen to the radio, which you probably know is not all that straightforward. Not all of them have chips in them. Maybe somebody here knows and can fill us in. So as an emergency broadcast system, FM is precious. And as a radio communications tool that is dedicated to peace, we do really need a reliable medium to preserve it, to prevent us from going into war. I should say just a few things why I'm so critical of the internet. I should tell you, to begin with, that one of the best articles I read recently in The Guardian was one that suggested that Google, Facebook, and Amazon should be nationalized. And I won't say much more about that, but it's something to keep in mind. How come that some of the richest corporations in the world are feeding off something that we so humbly say, oh, please give us access to it. They have it, and they make billions with their Ubers and their bed and whatever they're called. So that is an issue. And as an environmentalist, a climate change activist, I've been monitoring the power use of the internet as best as I can. And every now and then you get a sort of glimpse of it when they say, oh, Bitcoin. Every transaction for Bitcoin uses like a whole nuclear power plant to complete, because it requires so many stages. But yeah, what about all the little cats playing piano on Facebook? It's the same power they require. And one of my favorite articles by Jane Ann Morris is called The Bicycle-Powered Internet, and it was written a few years ago, so it's worse now. She tried to add up not your power use at home, but where it goes, the servers, the server farms, what one Google search initiates in contacts going down the lines. And in the end, her estimate 8 years ago or so was that if the internet wants to be green and would be bicycle powered, right, that would be really green, then 8 billion people would have to pedal to drive the internet 6 hours every day. Wow. So that was a few years ago. Okay. Now, Now the unions. I told somebody at the door I was going to, she said, no, not the unions. Okay. But since nobody else will do it, I'll do it. I had 10 years inside KPFA as a volunteer and later as a paid staff. And I was so fascinated with the principles, the ideas of Pacifica. And my little office was next to Vera Hopkins. Does anybody remember her? She was the historian. She was also one of the people who built FM radios. She went that far back. And every chance I had, I talked to her until she got booted out of the building by David Salniker. So one of the really interesting ways of organizing a radio station was that you had departments. And there was a music, drama and literature, public affairs, news, and then the Third World Department. Anybody here who helped found that? The Third World Department happened, and then we did the Women's Department. And the concept, the idea was that these people who were heading the departments were not to be on the air. Their job was to find people to be on the air or record people to be on the air. They had no right to take the air. And for, Pacifica history is funny. That worked sometimes really well and sometimes not so well. But in terms of the relationship between paid staff and so-called volunteers, it pointed to this odd relationship that either department head said, we don't need volunteers, I'm going to own this space, I'll be on the air. Or they would say, if you're really nice, I give you some time, but if you're not so nice, you're out. And in terms of union history, the first union at KPFA was the United Electrical Workers, the UE, which is one of, I actually don't know their current history, but it came about in the 30s. They had an early stand against racism. They separated themselves out from the other union movement that was anti-black, because they felt that was wrong. And what's really beautiful is that the United Electrical Workers in 1949 left the CIO over Cold War issues, over anti-communism. So they disassociated themselves from the CIO. And when I came to KPFA, I was automatically in the UE. And I didn't even have to pay dues because I was not a paid staff, but the paid staff paid dues. And the UE was protecting me as well as others. And when Pat Scott fired me, the UE steward came in with me, and he said to Pat Scott, you know, Pat Scott, I just came out of negotiations with General Electric, and you are worse. So WBAI was also affiliated with the UE, and in 1997 something really bad happened. At BAI in New York, management filed an NLRB suit against the UE to have unpaid staff removed from the bargaining unit. And it was a really interesting, in union history, like a really amazing, interesting case. You know, you do the work, so you're a worker. Seems simple, but you had to be paid to be really acknowledged. And what was even more amazing was that in the first round, the NLRB found in favor of the UE, said they're right, these are workers. And then Pacifica appeared with your money. And I have to admit, I don't know, maybe you know, Isis, do you know what came of it in the end?
The unpaid staff were removed from the bargaining unit, and I
At
believe
BAI.
that affected all unpaid staff everywhere.
Yeah.
Not just in Pacifica Land.
Thank you. So in the middle of all this, same year, 1997, KPFA staff decided to leave the UE and join the CWA. And I had still access to staff members who said, don't do this. Even if you want to do it later, don't do it now. You have to support the UE unit at BAI. They're in the middle of this amazing, for union history, for worker history, amazing event. And don't stab them in the back, but they did. And we had a national board meeting here in Berkeley, and they all marched in with a little CWA and said, hi, we're CWA, and bye. And we said, stay here. This is one of the more important Pacifica meetings. They're just about to, I forget now what they were just about to do, but it was. Anyway, I fear that the union and the staff is something that really needs to be looked at. Because in the end, those people who had all the power over the volunteers, who by union standards were supervisors, they were management, they were not part of the workers group. At one time, pretty much all the workers were unpaid. And I think that's also, a beautiful example for being able to involve people from the community. So, closing out with this I'm talking to LPFM people all the time, and somebody said, we just went out in the air and we had a big discussion. We said, you want to be on the air? Okay, you need to pay to be on the air. And, we need to get our little transmitter built, and we need to pay the electric bills. And I didn't exactly support that, but I could see the point, It's a privilege to be on the air. And to have people own the air for year after year after year after decade is really distressing for me. I mean, there are people now still owning the air, who were owning the air in 1982 when I came. And in terms of, saving money, paying back the debt, smaller staffs are really a good idea. And for you, with a union heart, don't fear you are doing them wrong. They are managers, they're not workers, for the most part. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariah. Now, one of the issues that, as a matter of fact, came up yesterday at the local station board meeting was that a unpaid staff member here, Anthony, was given a report asking a question of the manager about the situation of software, editing software at the station, and the change of that software without notification of the staff, which is an important question. If software is changed at the station for editing, it affects everyone, it affects your ability to do work. And one of the board members actually had the temerity to say, how dare you ask that question? It doesn't belong here. You should privately go to the manager and ask that question. So now this is an elected staff representative raising a question, and he was challenged at that meeting that he didn't have the right to raise that question at the meeting. And that's part of the problem that we have today. But I wanted to have our next speaker come up because he has been in a fight to train the apprentices and to use streaming and new technology at the station. And we're going to hear later some very important developments because of the digital revolution. Although there are some concerns about it, it has offered a great opportunity for KPFA and Pacifica to broaden our broadcast and broaden our coverage and also add new programs. So our next speaker is Frank Sterling, and he works with the apprentice program. He's trained many apprentices, and he's going to talk about some of the struggles at the station and also how we can use the apprentices in the future and the work that they're doing. So welcome, Frank Sterling.
Hey, how y'all doing? Good to see everybody tonight. And I wasn't as prepared to come here and give a big speech. I thought we were going to do more of a panel, but I do have a lot to say about KPFA and the apprenticeship program and how we are a network of volunteers there that have been volunteering for around 30 years. I believe the apprenticeship program started in the 80s, and for many years there was no on-air outlet. How many of you listened to the apprenticeship program show Full Circle? Anybody? All right, we got some fans out there. So that show didn't even get on the air until I believe it was around 2000 or I think it was after the 99 thing. It was before my time at there. I came into KPFA through the apprenticeship program in 2005 as just an apprentice and learned radio through the apprenticeship program. And then when I graduated in 2007, I was offered an opportunity as a fellow at KPFA on the apprenticeship program. At that time, KPFA and the apprenticeship program had 3 fellowships. One would be a technical director. That's my current title. Another would be a segment editor, and then the third would be the executive producer. And what those fellowships were at the time was a 1-year paid program through KPFA where you got to be a segment editor or be an executive producer or a technical director, so that when you moved on, you would have on your resume that you were a paid technical director at KPFA, or you were a lead segment editor for the apprenticeship program, or you were the senior producer of a 1-hour weekly show. So those were great programs, and when we started learning about the original crisis when people were struggling to make cuts, the apprenticeship program was one of the first to be cut, and what they had taken away was the fellowships. So when my 1 year ended in mid-2008 or early 2009, I just stayed on, and they let me stay on. But the other 2 that dropped out, the senior producer and the segment editor, they had initiated a hiring freeze at KPFA, and they wouldn't allow us to hire any more help. So the apprenticeship program, had suffered a little bit through the crisis, the financial crisis in the earliest days. And I think at that point too, there was also a lot of severance packages. People had quit for the severance packages, and they had cut like Hard Knock, some Flashpoint, and some other shows that you might be familiar with were cut out of there. I was trying to do some math earlier and seeing how the apprenticeship program provides volunteer work for KPFA. And right now we have about 8 volunteers that come in weekly, and we provide about 1,200 hours a year. That's just kind of a low estimate because we're actually do more work than we allot for. So I think the apprentices put in about 3 to 4 hours is what we ask of them a week. And what they're doing there is they're serving the station. They're answering the phones. One thing that the apprenticeship does is we're like the face or the voice to the community, because when you call in and you want a PSA or a public service announcement or a community calendar announcement, or when you mail your events in, they come to us, and then we filter through them and reach out and get contact information and produce the community calendars and the PSAs, amongst other things that we do there. So that's one thing I'm really proud of, that the apprenticeship program, I didn't do the math over 30 years, but if you times 1,200, maybe 1,500 times 30 years, you can see that we put in many volunteer hours at KPFA. I'm really proud to be a part of that. And another thing that I'm very interested in, and I was part of the local station board from, I think it was 2009 or 10, and then I did 6 years as a staff elected representative until I think the 2015, I think, is when I termed out, so I couldn't run again. And one thing that I really wanted to get into, as Steve mentioned, was the video streaming aspect. And I can wave to the camera over there. If anybody hasn't noticed over there at the camera, that this is being video streamed right now, right? One of my most, I don't know if most famous or one of my most proudest moments of a video streaming was the Block the Vote, the event. You guys remember Block the Vote? Anybody a part of that? So when the Zim ship was coming in and they were gonna have a big protest at the port, I tried to arrange with the organizers of the event to, why don't we have a live stream and have KPFA video stream that and also have it broadcast live on the air. And if many of you remember, I had the green light for a little while, but then they said no. And then we started a big email campaign to the management, and they went back to the original plan, and we had a great video stream. John over there was the videographer. And if many of you remember that day, it's actually still up on YouTube. You can still watch it if you search KPFA and Block the Boat. You can see the interviews. And it was something I was really proud of. We got a lot of feedback from people all over the world that watched that and were part of that. And I think it marks not just a turning point for KPFA, because we had done other video streams thanks to John. In 2009, I believe, I did the Iraq Veterans Against the War roundtable, and we video streamed that, where we had veterans come in and talk about their experiences of war. And we also spoke with victims of the war. So it's something I really wanted to do, and through my experiences with some of the management, we've had issues getting it brought to the forefront. And I think now we're seeing like Democracy Now!, they've been videoing for a long time. And who's the young lady from Southern California, Sonali Kahatkar, she has Free Speech TV. So there are people doing it, and I think it's something that we could do. As apprentices, we were live streaming our weekly show with just a webcam in the corner so you could just see us. But we've had special events where we went out in the public. As Steve mentioned, that's one of the great things about KPFA. When KPFA is broadcasting its regularly scheduled program, there used to be a video channel on KPFA. Anybody remember the video channel? It was kind of new, it worked for a few times, but when they recreated the website, they left it out. And one thing that puzzled me about it and made me start thinking is, why did they leave that out? But one thing I realized at the moment, it was our free access to KPFA. We didn't have to fit in the 24-hour slice of pie that is the radio broadcast of the day. While the radio went on, we could be on the internet broadcasting live at another event, broadcasting music, broadcasting protest. We did the March for Climate Leadership. You guys remember the big March for Climate Leadership a couple years back? So we video streamed that through the march, and then we set up a table at the end, and we sat down, did interviews, and it was basically without any management support. And I think we're missing out on possible revenue from, speaking of the crisis and the financial crisis, possible revenue from that. One example I want to bring up is the, I can't think of his first name, but he's coming up, a KPFA speaker, Finkelstein. You guys know his first name? Lauren Finkelstein. So this is a person that has worldwide recognition. Is one reason to video stream, right? Because if you have a KPFA event in Berkeley and the building holds 200 people, you're limited to selling 200 tickets. And I've seen in the past, they just had an event, they had to upgrade the place because the first place sold out. So imagine selling tickets around the country or around the world for a virtual ticket, So we could sell this for the price of a ticket. You can get sent a link and you could watch the video stream at home. And it also can help people that might have disabilities that are homebound that want to participate and want to watch. And I think that's the beauty of the live stream, is that people that want to be a part of stuff that can't actually get there and be a part of it can be a part of it through video streaming, whether it has commentators and people giving you context of what's happening, or just running a camera at a speaker and watching them, listening to them speak. So the Finkelstein event. So one thing that we could do is we could sell those virtual tickets to people around the country, around the world. They could watch that. And I think one of the arguments against that might be that, well, maybe people won't go to the event, or maybe people won't buy the KPFA DVD later because they already saw it. But I think people that attend the events still want to get the sound or still want to get the video. And I think the same will be for people that watch it virtually through the internet. They'll still want to participate. And they still, if they did buy it, they bought a ticket. So it's a little extra profit. So I want to do more video streaming. I've talked to John a couple of times. We've done numerous ones. We got a camera. Carol Wolfley and some of her friends got us this great camera that we haven't really been able to utilize. And that's one thing I really would like KPFA to do in the future, is to have a video channel on there. The first time we had it on the original website, it was so simple. You look to the left of the screen and there's a video camera. You click on the video camera and it takes you to a video screen, and then you click on that link and you watch the video. And it could pop up at any time if someone was out there in the street, but now they have eliminated that. And let me just give you one more quick example of what we would have to do now if you wanted to have a video stream, a random video stream. You'd have to create a community calendar event, and so a random person out in cyberspace or the internet would want to watch. They would have to go to the community calendar webpage, and then they would have to click on the event, and you can't put a hyperlink in the event, so they have to click on the event, get to the event, read, and then you could put a link in the event. And that link would take you to the video space, and then you click on a link there, so you can see it's already going and going and going. So one thing that I spoke with the man, I'm blanking on his name too, the young man that has done our current web page. And how many of you know that our web page was even done with a no bid deal? Do you guys remember that? You guys remember that? So I was part of the LSB at that time. So, and I believe it was the current management, Mr. McCoy, who had worked at the museum in Oakland. He had done the website there, and he had some guys that were going to do it for us. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, that our website was done through a no-bid deal where we could, who knows what we could have had. Some people are not happy with the website. I'm not a big user of it, but I did talk to one of the men that had worked on it, and he says we are capable of having a video channel back on there. So it's something I want to bring up, and I know that they tried to do some video on the Black History Month on Saturday. Did anybody see any of that? No? I wasn't sure either because I didn't get a chance to do that, but I think it's a possibility and something that we could use, and it's something that could be on kpfa.org while the radio is playing whatever it's playing, and it could be an alternative stream. And it could also be partially monetized in these certain aspects by broadcasting the KPFA speeches, the KPFA talks. What else do I want to talk about? Since we're talking about the crisis tonight, I think if we think back to the time of the cutbacks at KPFA when we lost the fellows from the apprenticeship program, we lost some folks from Hard Knock Radio, from Flashpoints, and from other spaces in KPFA. We had the morning mix at that time. Do you guys remember the morning mix? You guys remember the morning mix? All right. So whether you're a fan of the morning mix or not, or what you thought about the morning show, which I actually loved when Andrea, remind me of her last name. Andrea Lewis was doing the morning. I was a really big fan of that. And then I remember she moved and came back and she had a different show and stuff. But when we were struggling for income and someone tried to make a decision to have an hour in the morning 5 days a week, that was a program of volunteers, it was fought hard against by a lot of people. And it just goes to show some of the things that people have to make those decisions, try to do stuff like that. And there's so many different opinions at KPFA, which is one of the beauty of KPFA, but it also sometimes is the downfall. And I just thought that was a glorious time that we had made this move, and we had volunteers working. We were on prime time. We had a rotating cast of different ideas and different visions of people. And that's kind of one thing that I'm also proud of about the KPFA apprenticeship program, is because we bring people in that are from different backgrounds, of different nationalities, different genders, different everything, and they get to create a 1-hour radio show. And I think that shows the power of community getting involved with a station like KPFA. And like I said, they've been doing that. We have been doing that for over 30 years and been on the air for probably 18 or 20 years in the form of Full Circle Radio on Friday nights at 7 p.m., by the way. And real quick, while I'm thinking about it, the KPFA apprenticeship program is seeking new applicants. If you know anybody or are interested yourself in being on the radio, you could go to KPFA and get an application during normal business hours, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. But you could also download one on the KPFA Apprentice webpage, which is kpfaapprentice.org. And before they did our new website, this is why we're speaking of websites and what I'm talking about, the KPFA apprenticeship program created a WordPress website and where we got to post a lot of our stuff before KPFA really did their new site. And we're looking into posting on kpfa.org. We got one apprentice here. How many apprentices we got here? We got Sharon Peterson. Raise your hand, Sharon, so you know. So Sharon is a current apprentice. You know, there's not too many of us here tonight, but we are mighty. And what we do is we post on the KPFA website, the community calendars and all that other stuff too. But we really want to start posting more on the KPFA website. But we do have a beautiful website called kpfaapprentice.org. And we've been posting photos there, links to important articles, extended interviews to some of the interviews that we do that are cut short for airtime. So before I continue rambling, I would just like to say that one thing I want to look forward to, and I encourage us all to support, is the video streaming on KPFA, because that's going to open up a whole nother avenue, one, for content and for the video aspect, but also it could be a financial gain for us if we learn how to monetize that and if we sell virtual tickets to certain events. I mean, a lot of times I don't even want to drive out just from Antioch to see something, but I would sit at my computer and watch it, and I'd be willing to buy a virtual ticket, and I know a lot of other people out there would. And another thing that is an issue with this is I think we need to really get behind supporting this on the air. If we're going to do a big video broadcast, it needs to be promoted, talked about, and focused on to make it a success. And I think if we could get management support, maybe we could do it for Norman Finkelstein, because that's someone I feel like that can get some draw from people around the country or around the world. And so if you're just out there, you're on the internet, you're sending emails out, why don't you send some out to the general manager of KPFA, I think it's GM at kpfa.org, program director PD at KPFA, and say that you support video streaming on KPFA and that you'd like to watch KPFA when you can, or you'd like to see an event that you might not be able to make it to from home. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. And if there's going to be questions later, I'm not sure if there is, I'll be willing to answer any questions about KPFA that I know or the apprenticeship program. Personally, like I said, I'm coming up on 15 years. It's been an honor to kind of sit here and hear the histories that have been coming out, you know, people that back, you know, from before I was there. So it just makes me feel good to stand up here and to be able to actually speak after these folks. And that, you know, I've been there almost 15 years now. And the people that are speaking tonight, you know, there's over 100 years of voices here that are coming of experience, you know, and I think it's good to listen to because our stories are KPFA, just like your stories are KPFA, however you're tied to it, whether you're a phone room volunteer, whether you're a paid staff member, or whether you just are a listener that donates. You know, KPFA is all of our station, and I think that's one thing that we have to remember when we're in these times of crisis, that we need to be acknowledged as listeners who are paying for the lights, who are paying for people's health care and their salary. We, as people that give to KPFA, need to be kept in the light about what's happening with KPFA, the financial matters. I'm one believer that if we'd put this out, you know, that we were struggling with this in the beginning and that we needed to do something, our listeners and our base and our people out there would support us. And it wouldn't be such a shock that, oh, we could close our doors in 2 weeks or something. This should have been something that was brought up early, and that was look to the listeners for answers. Look to what the people who have been supporting us all these years, you know, even generations of their families who they've been supporting all these years, let them know what our situation is so they could actually make a difference. Yeah. And I'll leave it on that.